The summer of 1863 had been a season of nervous stillness in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For me, young Thomas, the days were measured by the familiar rhythms of farm life, the lowing of cattle at dawn, the scent of freshly turned earth, and the oppressive, humid air that promised a late afternoon thunderstorm. But the storm that arrived on the first day of July was not one of nature's making. It began as a distant, percussive grumble, a sound unlike any thunder I had ever heard. It was a man-made tempest, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to shake the very foundations of my world. From the rise behind our family's farmhouse, I watched, my heart a frantic bird in my chest, as smoke billowed above the trees in the distance. The war, once a distant rumor in newspapers, had finally arrived at my doorstep. My mother called me back to the house, her voice tight with a fear I had never heard before. We barred the doors and shuttered the windows, but the sounds of battle could not be kept out. The roar of cannons grew louder, punctuated by the sharp, popping crackle of rifle fire that sounded like 1,000 branches snapping at once. Each explosion felt personal, a direct assault on the peace I had always known. I thought of my older brother, Samuel, who had marched off 2 years earlier with the 1st Minnesota Infantry. Was he out there, somewhere in that terrible noise? The thought was a cold knot of dread in my stomach, a fear so profound it stole the air from my lungs and left me trembling in the dim light of the kitchen. The battle raged for 3 days. The world shrank to the 4 walls of our farmhouse, the constant, deafening symphony of destruction our only companion. My mother and I huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, our prayers lost in the cacophony. Sleep offered no escape as the fighting often continued into the night, the darkness lit by the terrifying flashes of artillery fire. I would creep to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters at the hellish landscape. The familiar fields where I had played as a boy were now stages for unimaginable violence. The war was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing monster devouring my home, my peace, and my innocence with every cannon blast. When the guns finally fell silent on the 3rd day, the silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a heavy, profound stillness, broken only by the distant, haunting cries of the wounded and the dying. The air, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and something else, something metallic and sweet, hung over the land like a shroud. The world I had known before the battle was gone, shattered into a million pieces. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that nothing would ever be the same again. The war had come, and it had left its indelible, bloody mark upon our lives and our land. In the aftermath of the battle, the war did not leave. It simply changed its form. The armies moved on, but they left behind a sea of human suffering. Our family farm, like so many others around Gettysburg, was transformed overnight into a makeshift field hospital. The barn, the yard, and even the house itself became a sanctuary for the broken men in blue and gray. The familiar scent of hay and livestock was replaced by the grim odors of blood, sweat, and infection. Soldiers with shattered limbs, torn flesh, and vacant, staring eyes lay on every available surface, their groans and pleas for water creating a constant, sorrowful chorus that echoed day and night. I was no longer a boy. I was forced to become a man in a matter of hours. My mother and I worked tirelessly, our hands raw and our bodies aching with exhaustion. We fetched water from the well, tore clean linens into bandages, and spooned thin broth into the mouths of men too weak to feed themselves. I learned to look past the horrific wounds, to see the person beneath the blood and grime. I saw farmers, shopkeepers, and students, all of them someone's son or brother, now reduced to helpless suffering. The experience carved deep lines of premature age into my young face, stripping away the last vestiges of my childhood innocence with each life I tried to comfort. The emotional toll was immense. I listened to men cry out for their mothers in their delirium. I held the hands of soldiers as they spoke their last words, entrusting me with messages for loved ones I would never meet. I saw courage in the face of unbearable pain and despair in the eyes of those who knew their time was short. My mother, a pillar of quiet strength, moved through the chaos with a determined grace, but I saw the exhaustion in her eyes and the tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. The farm was no longer a place of life and growth, but a house of sorrows, a grim testament to the war's brutal harvest. Every time a new wagon of wounded arrived, I searched the faces, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. I looked for Samuel. With each passing soldier who was not my brother, a small measure of relief warred with a growing, gnawing anxiety. The men of the 1st Minnesota had been in the thick of the fighting on the 2nd day, I had heard. They had made a desperate charge, suffering terrible casualties. The thought of Samuel lying wounded and alone on that field, or worse, was a constant torment. The farm was full of strangers suffering, but it was the fate of my own brother that haunted my every waking moment. On the 4th day after the battle, as the sun began its slow descent, a Union ambulance wagon rumbled up the lane to the farm. 2 soldiers carefully lifted a stretcher from the back. On it lay a figure in a torn and blood-soaked blue uniform. My heart leaped into my throat. I ran from the barn, my feet heavy as if moving through mud. As I drew closer, I recognized the pale, drawn face beneath a layer of dirt and dried blood. It was Samuel. My brother was home, but not in the triumphant way I had always imagined. He was broken, a casualty of the very battle that had ravaged our home. Samuel was carried into the house and placed gently on the bed in his own room, a space that had remained untouched since the day he left. My mother wept silently as she began to clean his wounds. A Confederate mini-ball had shattered his thigh, and a field surgeon had done what little they could. A fever now raged through his body, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, his words a jumbled mix of battlefield commands and childhood memories. I sat by the bedside, holding my brother's hand, a hand that felt both familiar and strangely fragile. I saw not the strong, confident older brother who had taught me to fish and skip stones, but a frail, suffering boy. In his brief moments of lucidity, Samuel would look at me, his eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. He spoke of the charge, of the smoke and the terror of seeing his friends fall beside him. He did not speak of glory or heroism, only of the terrible, deafening noise and the fear. "We just had to hold the line, Tommy," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Just had to hold the line?" He tried to smile, but it was a grimace of pain. In those moments, the two of us shared a silent understanding. The war was not an adventure. It was a thief that stole futures and left only pain in its wake. I stayed by my brother's side through the long, dark night. I listened to his labored breathing, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth and offering him sips of water. I told Samuel stories of the farm, of how the crops were coming in, of the new calf born that spring, trying to anchor him to the world of peace we had once shared. I willed my own strength into my brother, praying for a miracle, for the fever to break, for the dawn to bring healing. But as the night wore on, Samuel's breathing grew shallower, his moments of clarity less frequent. The war had followed him home, and it was slowly, relentlessly claiming its prize. Just as the first pale gray light of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, a profound stillness fell over the room. Samuel's labored breathing ceased. His eyes, which had been restless, were now calm. He opened them one last time and looked at Thomas, a flicker of recognition, of peace passing through them. Then, with a final, gentle sigh, he was gone. The silence he left behind was absolute, a void that seemed to suck all the air and warmth from the room. Thomas sat frozen, still holding his brother's hand, which was now growing cold. The war had taken everything. It had taken his brother. His mother entered the room, her face a mask of grief. She did not need to ask. She knelt by the bed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Thomas felt a hollowness inside him, a vast, empty space where his childhood used to be. He looked out the window at the rising sun, which was painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. It seemed a cruel mockery, this beautiful sunrise in a world so full of ugliness and loss. The world outside was beginning a new day, but for Thomas, something had ended forever. The true cost of the war was no longer an abstract number of casualties reported in a newspaper. It was the empty bed, the silent room, the cold hand in his own. They buried Samuel on the hill behind the farmhouse in a simple grave overlooking the fields he had loved. There was no military funeral, no rifle salute, only the quiet words of a prayer and the weeping of a mother and a brother. The Battle of Gettysburg was over, and the Union had claimed victory. But for Thomas, standing by that fresh mound of earth, the word victory was meaningless. It was a hollow sound that could not fill the immense silence left by his brother's death. He now understood that war's ledger was not balanced with wins and losses, but with individual sorrows, with families torn apart and futures erased. In the weeks and months that followed, Thomas continued to help on the farm, moving with the heavy, deliberate steps of an old man. The physical scars on the landscape of Gettysburg would eventually fade. The fields would be plowed and replanted, the fences mended, the buildings repaired. But the internal scars, the ones carved into the hearts of families like his, would remain. The memory of his brother and the terrible price of the conflict that took him would shape the man he was to become. The war had come to his home, and it had left him with a grief as deep and enduring as the land itself. A year later, and hundreds of miles to the south, the war raged on in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Here, another teenager, Private Elijah Davies of the 12th Ohio Infantry, was learning his own hard lessons about conflict. At 17, Elijah had enlisted with dreams of adventure and a fervent belief in the Union cause, but the reality of a soldier's life was a brutal awakening. It was not a world of heroic charges and gleaming banners, but one of endless marching, gnawing hunger, and constant, wearying fatigue. His days were a monotonous cycle of drill, picket duty, and short rations of hardtack and salt pork, all under the watchful, nervous eye of Confederate raiders. The romantic notions of war had been stripped away by the harsh realities of the campaign. Elijah's uniform was faded and perpetually damp, his boots worn thin from countless miles on dusty or muddy roads. He learned to sleep anywhere, on hard ground or in a crowded tent, his rifle always within arm's reach. He learned to ignore the persistent ache in his back and the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. The enemy was not just the men in gray uniforms across the valley, but also the relentless summer heat, the swarms of biting insects, and the ever-present threat of sickness that swept through the camps like wildfire, claiming more lives than bullets did. The landscape of the Shenandoah Valley, with its rolling hills and lush farms, was beautiful, but it was a beauty tainted by the specter of war. Every barn could hide a sniper, every wooded ridge a line of enemy infantry. The bucolic scenery was a constant, ironic backdrop to the grim business of soldiering. Elijah and his comrades foraged for food, often taking from the very farms they were meant to be liberating, an act that sat uneasily with his sense of right and wrong. He saw the faces of the Virginian families, etched with fear and resentment, and realized the lines of the conflict were far more complicated than he had ever imagined back home in Ohio. Youthful bravado quickly gave way to a hardened pragmatism. Elijah learned to read the sounds of the woods, to distinguish the snap of a twig from the cocking of a rifle. He learned the grim arithmetic of survival. Keep your head down, keep your powder dry, and trust the man next to you. The boy who had left home seeking glory was being forged into a soldier, a process that meant shedding his innocence piece by piece. The war was not a grand crusade. It was a daily struggle for survival, a long, grueling ordeal that tested the limits of his physical and emotional endurance. In the crucible of camp life, bonds of friendship were forged with the strength of steel. For Elijah, his closest companion was another private named Thomas, a quiet, thoughtful boy from a neighboring town in Ohio. They had enlisted together, two youths swept up in the same patriotic fervor. They shared their meager rations, read letters from home to each other, and stood shoulder to shoulder on the picket line, talking in low voices through the long, lonely nights. Their shared experiences, the fear, the boredom, the homesickness, created a connection deeper than any Elijah had known before. Thomas was his anchor, a reminder of the peaceful world they had left behind. But the greatest killer in the Civil War was not the bullet, but disease. In the late summer of 1864, a wave of sickness swept through the camp. It started with a fever and a cough, and it quickly spread through the crowded, unsanitary tents. Thomas fell ill. At first, Elijah was not worried. Men got sick all the time. He brought his friend extra water and tried to coax him to eat. But Thomas only grew weaker, his body consumed by the fever. He was moved to the crowded field hospital, a place from which few men returned. Elijah visited him every day, watching helplessly as his friend wasted away. The day Thomas died, there was no battle, no fanfare, no glory. He simply slipped away in a feverish delirium, whispering the name of his mother. Elijah was holding his hand. The loss was a quiet, personal agony, a profound and hollow ache that settled deep in Elijah's soul. He had seen death on the battlefield, a sudden and violent spectacle. But this was different. This was slow, insidious, and deeply personal. His friend was gone, not in a blaze of heroic sacrifice, but stolen by a silent, invisible enemy in a dirty tent far from home. The war had taken his friend. and Elijah felt an anger and a grief that he had no words for. Returning to his own tent that evening, the sight of Thomas's empty cot was unbearable. The small space they had shared now felt vast and desolate. His friend's belongings, a worn Bible, a half-finished letter, a tintype photograph of his family, were stark reminders of the life that had been extinguished. For Elijah, the war had now become intensely personal. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about avenging a personal loss. He held on to his grief and his anger, letting it harden inside him. It was a heavy burden, but it was also a shield, a way to protect himself from the overwhelming sorrow and fear that threatened to consume him. Weeks later, at the Third Battle of Winchester, Elijah's grief was forged into action. The order came down the line: "Fix bayonets! Forward! Charge!" The moment hung in the air, thick with dread and adrenaline. Elijah looked down the long blue line of his comrades, their faces grim and determined. He thought of his friend Thomas, of the empty cot, and a cold resolve settled over him. The fear was still there, a knot of ice in his stomach, but it was now mixed with a burning rage. The bugles sounded the advance, a clear, piercing call that cut through the morning air, and with a guttural roar, the entire line surged forward across the open field. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of noise, smoke, and terror. Cannonballs tore through the ranks, and the air was thick with the whistle of minié-balls. Men fell around him, some silently, others with a sharp cry of pain. Elijah kept his eyes fixed on the Confederate line ahead, a long streak of flashing fire and gray smoke. He ran, his lungs burning, his mind numb to everything but the singular purpose of reaching the enemy. He fired his rifle, reloaded on the run in a series of frantic, practiced motions, and fired again. There was no time for thought, only for the brutal, chaotic dance of battle. It was kill or be killed. He was almost to the enemy earthworks when a searing pain erupted in his left shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him to the ground. The world tilted, the sky and the grass trading places. The roar of the battle faded to a distant hum. He lay there, stunned, the smell of blood and churned earth filling his nostrils. He saw his comrades sweep past him, their faces contorted in a mask of fury, and watched as they crashed into the Confederate line. The charge was a success. The battle was won. But Elijah lay wounded, his own war momentarily over, victory tasting of ashes and his own blood. Elijah survived. He was carried from the field and spent months in a hospital, slowly recovering from his wound. When he was finally sent home to Ohio, he was no longer the boy who had left. He carried a lead ball in his shoulder and deeper, invisible scars on his soul. He had seen the horrors of war firsthand, had lost his best friend, and had taken lives. He was a veteran, a hero to his town, but his youth was a casualty, left behind on the battlefields of Virginia. He would carry the memory of the charge and the face of his friend Thomas for the rest of his days, a solemn reminder of the true and terrible price of the last full measure of devotion.